Over the past few days, George Soros has ended up in the headlines. Now, I suppose a rumor was going around saying that he died, and it was pervasive enough to elicit a response from Georgie Boy himself, in which he simply stated, "I am still alive." And of course he is. He made a deal with the devil. I'm kidding. Or am I? Regardless, we won't go into the whole thing, but essentially Elon Musk said, and I quote, "You assume that he has good intentions. He does not. George Soros wants to erode the very fabric of civilization. George Soros hates humanity," end of quote. And apparently this is enough to set off the fragile minds of the shills, and everybody lost it. Naturally, I assume that you've seen this deflection from pretty much everybody in the media. If you criticize Soros, they immediately try to label you as an anti-Semitic fool. Worse than Hitler himself. Now, besides the fact that arguing that criticizing George Soros makes you anti-Semitic is, one of the dumbest positions you could possibly take, well, a lot of people came out to defend him. Personally, I believe it's a clear example of the power he wields with his purse, because really, there is no defending him. For example, just what is commonly known, even the information that shows up in a simple Google search, shows exactly what kind of guy we're dealing with. And they all know about this stuff, but decide to ignore it. And why would that be? Well, it's an interesting question considering what this dude considers to be quote-unquote standard business practice. George Soros has collapsed entire nations, and the sole reason he did it was either for profit or to promote his own personal political agenda. Yes, he has collapsed entire societies overnight, destroyed their currency, and for some of these countries, it took decades and decades to pull out of the disaster. And of course, he destroyed the lives of innocent people along the way. And the real crazy part is that he laughs about it. So, without even going into the fray on George Soros' theories, what has been proven, what is openly talked about, his predatory financial schemes alone, well, they deserve the utmost scrutiny, criticism, and ignoring the damage that he has done throughout his entire life is simply the move of cowardice. George Soros is not some benevolent, philanthropist, nor a simple political donor, nor is he merely a sincere observant of geopolitics. He wields ruthless tactics in business and politics. His initiatives destroy lives. On top of that, he manipulates national markets with the goal of dissolution in some cases, and preys upon those who cannot afford to fight back. He is nothing to admire, nor someone to aspire to be. And so, with that being said, and now that a target has been affixed to the channel, let's talk about the truth about George Soros. Now, just so we're on the same page, let's start with an article by Jim Garrity, and I'll place the links in the pinned comment. So this came out on November 1st, 2018. So the article starts off by highlighting what the New York Times says about this, and how they try to villainize people. And I quote, "On both sides of the Atlantic, a loose network of activists and political figures on the right have spent years seeking to cast Mr. Soros not just as a well-heeled political opponent, but also as the personification of all they detest. And here's the real crazy part, and I quote again, employing barely coded anti-Semitism, they have built a warped portrayal of him as a mastermind of a globalist movement, a left-wing radical who would undermine the established order and a proponent of diluting the white Christian nature of their societies through immigration," end of quote. So, okay, the New York Times is trash. Now, I'm trying to not get caught up in the bullshit, but that is a crazy thing to say. The only reason people oppose Soros, according to the New York Times, is their belief that he's trying to dilute the white Christian nature of society through immigration. I mean, really, I cannot believe people still fall for this. Anyway, while they frame it in their usual insane way, the reality is that George Soros is very open about his philosophy on open borders. Now, they do use this as a simple mechanism for destabilizing national sovereignty, and those who recognize that oppose this concept. However, by framing it in the way that they did, well, that's how they villainize people, And at this point, it's an old and worn-out tactic. And so I figured it would be a good moment to sort out the nonsense and internet rumors about Soros from the, verified truth, which is bad enough. And I quote, "George Soros was born in 1930, making him 9 when the war broke out and 15 when it ended. Now, there are quite a few rumors about what he did to help the Nazis. However, some cannot be verified. But some of the stories are. What is true is that to survive in that time and place, George Soros and his father Tavadar Soros assume a non-Jewish identity, Sandor Kiss. And it is due to this that George Soros poses as the godson of a Hungarian agricultural ministry bureaucrat named Bambach. And so his job was to take inventory of Jewish properties confiscated by the Nazis. Soros accompanied Bambach on one job. traveling to the estate of a wealthy Jewish aristocrat named Morik Kornfeld. What's not disputed is that Soros hung around the estate while Baumbach did his work for the Nazi occupying regime. However, what is disputed is what, if anything, Soros did while Baumbach took inventory. At this point in the article, the author states that there's no proof that Soros embraced the Nazi cause. However, that's not what this is about. No, we're not talking about whether or not George Soros believes in Nazi ideology. But let's back up. What the author here is referencing are the clips of George Soros interviews where he discusses confiscating property of recently imprisoned Jewish citizens. And as far as I know, the arguments people have do not revolve around Soros agreeing with the Nazis. In reality, it's used as some kind of antidote to his sociopathic nature, his indifference to suffering, and how guilt never even enters his mind. It's business, simple as. And it shows that from a young age, he has no qualms about destroying lives for profit or personal benefit. As I said, it's just business to him. And then the article goes into the transcript from the interview. However, let's just play it.
While hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being shipped off to the death camps, George Soros accompanied his phony godfather on his appointed rounds, confiscating property from the Jews. These are pictures from 1944 of what happened to George Soros's friends and neighbors.
You're a Hungarian Jew who escaped the Holocaust by posing as a Christian.
Right.
And you watched lots of people get shipped off to the death camps.
Right. I was 14 years old. And I would say that that's when my character was made.
In what way?
That one should think ahead, one should understand and anticipate events, and one is threatened. It was a tremendous threat of evil. I mean, it was a very personal experience of evil.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe as a child you don't see the connection, but it created no problem at all.
No feeling of guilt.
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go. I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. But there was no sense that I shouldn't be there, because that was, well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow. And it was whether I was there or not, I was only a spectator, the property was being taken away. So I had no role in taking away that property. So I had no sense of guilt.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No. It was actually probably the happiest year of my life, that year of German occupation. For me, it was a very positive experience. It's a strange thing, because you see incredible suffering around you, and in fact, you're in considerable danger yourself. But you're 14 years old and you don't believe that it can actually touch you. You have a belief in yourself, your belief in your father. It's a very happy-making, exhilarating experience.
So this tale of taking property was actually detailed in the autobiography of George Soros' father, Tavador Soros. Now, the main example they give is the property belonging to one Jewish aristocrat, as we talked about, Baron Morik Kornfeld. Now, by the way, Kornfeld was taken to the infamous Malthusian concentration camp, and so in return for permitting the Nazis to assume administration of his family's vast industrial enterprise, he and his family were allowed to leave for Portugal. Following the war, his holdings were nationalized and he never returned. So despite whatever worldview or philosophy as a boy George Soros had during World War II He's a committed, outspoken, and extraordinarily deep-pocketed liberal progressive. And really, it is no exaggeration to characterize George Soros' views as radical, particularly when compared to the American public. So due to the fact that George Soros grew to prominence in the U.S. political scene when he spent more than $25 million trying to defeat President George W. Bush, in the 2004 election, well, most members of the media think of him as just, another liberal billionaire, Tom Steyer or Michael Bloomberg, with a different accent. However, George Soros' views are oddly insidious. In 2006, he said, and I quote, "The main obstacle to a stable and just world is the United States. Not Iran, not Russia, not China, not Islamic terrorist groups or transnational crime. Nope, in his eyes, it's the United States." In 2010, he declared that China has, and I quote, "a better functioning government than the United States," end of quote. And so, this is a pretty interesting parallel to everyone in the media calling people who criticize Soros as anti-Semitic. By their own standards, he's the one who's anti-Semitic. Look, I don't make the rules. I do not make the rules. We are just playing by the left's well-established playbook. Soros is adamantly anti-Israel, which makes him anti-Semitic, right? We won't get into the hypocrisy of all the Democrats who are anti-Israel, but yeah, let's just stick with this for now. George Soros generously donates to groups that call on governments from around the world to sever or downgrade their diplomatic relations with Israel and calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. He's also made several comments that some interpret as blaming Jews for anti-Semitism, such as, and I quote, "I don't think that you can ever overcome anti-Semitism if you behave as a tribe. The only way you can overcome it is if you give up the tribalness," end of quote. Now, he also wrote in 2007, and I quote, "I do believe that attitudes towards Israel are influenced by Israeli policies, and attitudes towards the Jewish community are influenced by the pro-Israel lobby's success in suppressing divergent views," end of quote. Now, some of his comments either deliberately or inadvertently feed into the notion of Jewish control over American politics. And I quote again, "The pro-Israel lobby has been remarkably successful in suppressing criticism. Politicians challenge it at their peril, and that is simply due to their ability to influence political contributions. Academics have had their advancement blocked, and think tank experts their funding withdrawn when they step too far out of line. Anybody who dares to dissent may be subjected to a campaign of personal vilification. And some leaders of the Democrat Party have promised to bring a change of direction, but they cannot deliver on that promise until they are able to resist the dictates of the AIPAC," end of quote. Okay, so let's talk about open borders. The thing is that George Soros is not a fan of national borders or border enforcement. When criticizing Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in 2017, George Soros said, and I quote, "Viktor Orbán's plan treats the protection of national borders as the objective and the refugees as the obstacle. On the other hand, our plan treats the protection of refugees as the objective and national borders as the obstacle," end of quote. Now, on top of that, in many interviews, George Soros has decried nationalism and national identity as a menace. So, none of the information we've talked about is just a rumor, or secret recordings, or secondhand claims. George Soros lays out his beliefs in interviews, speeches, and articles. His viewpoints are not a secret. Anybody can look it up. However, now let's get into how he collapses entire societies and laughs about it.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
Yeah, all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do. As a competitor, I've got to compete to win. As a human being, I am concerned about the society in which I live.
Which George Soros am I talking to now? The amoral George Soros or the moral George Soros?
It's one person. It's one person who at one time engages in amoral activities and at the rest of the time tries to be moral.
So a video of George Soros speaking at the Asia Society Conference in 2015 has resurfaced, and in it he openly brags that, and I quote, "The Soros Empire has replaced the Soviet Empire."
The Soviet Empire collapsed, and as the empire collapsed, I moved in and picked up the pieces. First in Hungary in 1984, and then Poland in 87, China in 87 as well. And so this is how the Soros Empire was replacing the Soviet Empire.
And how do you think you're doing in your imperial ambitions?
So yeah, there you have it. The billionaire globalist George Soros would go on to say that he picked up the pieces of the fallen Soviet states and influenced the governments of Hungary, Poland, and other European nations too.
I think that people in the West don't appreciate how prepared and eager the Poles are to engage in radical reform. I went there and I discussed a very thorough and radical reorganization of the Polish economy, large-scale denationalization, and not only solidarity, but the government also endorsed this program. So the willingness is there.
Do you think the U.S. should back such a package of that magnitude this weekend?
I think the United States has to back a package of that magnitude, and I think the United States has to use its influence with at the G7 meeting in order to be able to not miss what is right now an historic opportunity. You have a gentleman on the program with me here who knows more about solidarity than I'm going to ever know, but the fact, it seems to me, is that solidarity now has a stake in the outcome of the Polish economy and the outcome of the political process.
You're a student of the Polish economy as well as the Hungarian. What do you say to that?
It is really, as Senator Biden said, a historic opportunity because there's never been a successful economic reform program carried through in a centrally planned economy. And in Poland, the political will is now there. And in a strange way, the very bad condition of the Polish economy is an opportunity. Because, for instance, inflation, which in the Soviet Union and to some extent Hungary is still latent, in Poland it's already there. So the economy is spinning out of control. The living standard is very low. So actually the resources that would be needed to turn it around are actually quite modest.
George Soros, the world agitator, who has manipulated the most vulnerable people in each free nation across the globe. And well, momentum is picking up. Yes, that is correct. People who've had enough of him are trying to out him. Now, I personally believe that advancements in digital communication, social media, the internet, well, our modern technological era, well, it could really help bring Soros out of the shadows and into the light. And I quote again, billionaire investor and activist George Soros has a giant footprint in Ukraine and other former USSR nations. Similar to his operations in dozens of other nations outside of the former USSR, he has, over the past couple of decades, poured tens of millions of dollars into non-governmental organizations, ostensibly to assist them in transforming their country into a more quote-unquote open and democratic society. Which, of course, are just talking points, buzzwords, or otherwise known as complete, utter lies. And I quote, "As the Soviet Empire unraveled, I moved in and picked up the pieces," Soros said with a smile. The quote-unquote Soros Empire replaced the Soviet Empire. He singled out Poland and the Baltic nations as success stories, and warned that a quote-unquote resurgent Russia was threatening not only reforms in the former Soviet Union, but also the power and influence of the European Union. He chastised Russian President Vladimir Putin for his actions in Ukraine and his stranglehold on public opinion. And I quote, "Putin will not change," Soros said. "He is now a prisoner of the genie he allowed to get out of the bottle," end of quote. Now, George Soros was slightly more optimistic about prospects for change in China. He said, and I quote, "China is at a crossroads. A more open civil society in China," he said, "would likely depend on the success of President Xi Jinping's economic reforms." When he was asked whether his organization was working in China, Soros was blunt, and I quote, "We would be happy to be engaged in China, but we are not welcome," end of quote. And really, he should not be welcomed anywhere, but greed is the hack. Yes, he uses politicians and their greed against them. The political establishment just cannot refuse money. Something within their personalities makes it impossible for them to resist. Yes, in my opinion, they have absolutely no moral structure besides greed and power, and George Soros exploits that. Anyway, this next bit of research comes from Steve Croft at CBS, and yes, I was surprised too. After World War II, George Soros attended the London School of Economics, where he fell under the spell of fellow atheist and Hungarian Karl Popper, one of his professors. Popper was a mentor to Soros until Popper's death in 1994. So, alright, Two of Popper's most influential teachings concerned the quote-unquote open society and fallibilism. Fallibilism is the philosophical doctrine that all claims of knowledge could, in principle, be mistaken. Then again, I could be wrong about that. Just kidding, but you get the point. The quote-unquote open society basically refers to a test and evaluate approach to social engineering. Regarding the open society, Ray Childs writes, and I quote, "Since World War II, most of Western democracies have followed Popper's advice about piecemeal social engineering and democratic social reform, and it has gotten them into a grand mess." End of quote. Now, in 1956, George Soros moved to New York City, where he worked on Wall Street and started amassing his fortune. He specialized in hedge funds and currency speculation. Soros is absolutely ruthless, amoral, and clever in his business dealings, and he quickly made his fortune. By the 1980s, he was well on his way to becoming the global powerhouse he is today. And so in one article presented in the American Thinker, they say, and I quote, "George Soros made his first $1 billion in 1992 by shorting the British pound, and he did so by leveraging billions in financial bets, and he became known as the man who broke the Bank of England." And yes, he broke it on the backs of hard-working British citizens, who, by the way, immediately saw their homes severely devalued and their life savings cut drastically, almost overnight. End of quote. So in 1994, George Soros crowed in the quote-unquote New Republic. Yes, he said that the former Soviet Empire is now called the Soros Empire. So, the Russiagate scandal in 1999, which almost collapsed the Russian economy, was labeled by Representative Jim Leach, then head of the House Banking Committee, to be, and I quote, "one of the greatest social robberies in human history. The Soros Empire, indeed." However, that is not all. In 1997, George Soros almost destroyed the economies of Thailand and Malaysia. At the time, Malaysia's Prime Minister called Soros a villain and a moron, end of quote. And then Thailand said this, and I quote, "We regard George Soros as a kind of Dracula. He sucks the blood from the people," end of quote. And yes, I agree. So, okay, the Greeks actually had something interesting to say as well. This appeared in one article quite a while ago, but it says, and I quote, "George Soros was part of the full-court press that dismantled Yugoslavia and caused trouble in Georgia, Ukraine, and Myanmar. Calling himself a full-on a philanthropist. George Soros' role is to tighten the ideological stranglehold of globalization and the New World Order while promoting his own financial gain. He is without conscience, a capitalist who functions with absolute amorality," end of quote. So, let's check in on France. What do they have to say about George Soros? Well, France did uphold a conviction against Soros for felony insider trading. George Soros was fined $2.9 million. Recently, his native Hungary fined him $2.2 million for, and I quote, "illegal market manipulation." Elizabeth Crum writes that the Hungarian economy has been in a state of transition as the country seeks to become more financially stable and westernized. Soros, deliberately driving down the share price of its largest bank, put Hungary's economy into a wicked tailspin, one from which they are still trying to recover, end of quote. So yeah, basically my whole point is that Soros is a planetary parasite. His grasp, greed, and gluttony have a global reach. But what about America? Well, George Soros gave one interview in Australia where he said this, and I quote, "America, as the center of the globalized financial markets, was sucking up the savings of the world. This is now over. The game is out," he said, adding that the time has come for a very serious adjustment in America's consumption habits. He implied that he was the one with the power to bring this about, end of quote. And yeah, this also aligns with Klaus Schwab's position. You will own nothing and be happy, or else. Now, just to maintain his perspective on everything, George Soros said this, and I quote, "World financial crisis was stimulating and, in a way, the culmination of my life's work," end of quote. Yes, his life's work has been destabilizing the world. Oh, how nice. The fact is that George Soros has been actively working to destroy America from the inside out for some years now. People have been warning us too. Years and years ago, before everybody in the media was subverted, the US media said this, and I quote, "George Soros is an extremist who wants open borders, a one-world foreign policy, legalized drugs, euthanasia, and on and on. This is off the charts dangerous." In 1997, Rachel Enfield wrote, and I quote, "George Soros uses philanthropy to change, or more accurately, deconstruct the moral values and attitudes of the Western world, and particularly of the American people," end of quote. Yes, his open society is not about freedom, it's about license. Yes, that's right, his vision rejects the very notion of liberty. in favor of this progressive ideology of rights and entitlements. Now, perhaps the most important of these quote-unquote whistleblowers are David Horowitz and Richard Poe. Their book, entitled The Shadow Party, outlines in detail how Soros hijacked the Democrat Party, and now owns it lock, stock, and barrel. George Soros has been packing the Democrat Party with radicals and ousting moderate Democrats for years. Yes, that is correct, the Shadow Party became the Shadow Government. So, by his own admission, he helped engineer coups in Slovakia, Croatia, Georgia, and Yugoslavia. When Soros targets a country for quote-unquote regime change, he begins by creating a shadow government, a fully formed government in exile, ready to assume power when the opportunity arises. Now, the shadow party he built in America greatly resembles those he has created in other countries prior to instigating a coup. End of quote. So you may be asking yourself, yes, the Democrats, but what about the Republicans? And as I often talk about, there isn't really a difference. We have a uniparty. So although George Soros doesn't yet own the Republican Party like he does the Democrats, make no mistake, his tentacles are spread throughout the Republican Party as well. As I said, the uniparty. You see, George Soros is a partner in the Carlyle Group, where he has invested more than $100 million. According to an article by the Baltimore Chronicle, they say, and I quote, "The quote-unquote Carlyle Group is run by a veritable who's who of former Republican leaders, from CIA man Frank Carlucci to CIA head and ex-president George Bush Sr." End of quote. However, once again, that is not all. In late 2006, George Soros bought about 2 million shares of Halliburton, Dick Cheney's old stomping grounds. Now check this out. When the Democrats and Republicans held their conventions in 2000, Soros held a shadow party convention in the same cities at the same exact time. Now in 2008, George Soros donated $5 billion to the DNC.
And at this moment in time, our country needs us. And we need people like George Soros, who is fearless and willing to step up when it counts. So please join me in welcoming George Soros.
This was to ensure that Obama won, and of course also solidified wins for many other Alinsky-trained radicals. Yes, George Soros has been contributing $1 billion plus to the DNC since Clinton came onto the scene. So, Soros has dirtied both sides of the aisle, trust me. And if that weren't bad enough, he also has long-held connections with the CIA. And I mustn't forget his ties to the mainstream media. You know, he owns 2.6 million shares of Time Warner, and various political advertising organizations as well. In short, George Soros controls or influences most of legacy media, and people still wonder why they don't criticize him. People still, for some reason, wonder why he's quote-unquote untouchable. Well, it's because of his checkbook. As Matthew Vadum writes, and I quote, "The liberal billionaire turned philanthropist has been buying up media properties for years in order to drive home his message to the American public, that they are too materialistic, too wasteful, too selfish, and too stupid to decide for themselves how to run their own lives." End of quote. Now, as a recent example of him buying up media companies, well, he was also the one who bought out Vice. Let's take a look at some of the NGOs he funds. So we have MoveOn.org, the Apollo Alliance, Media Matters for America, the Tides Foundation, the ACLU, Acorn, PDIA, which is the Project on Death in America, La Raza, and many, many more. And so Richard Poe continues, and I quote, "Through his global web of Open Society Institutes and Open Society Foundations, George Soros has spent 25 years recruiting, training, indoctrinating, and installing a network of loyal operatives in 50 countries, placing them in positions of influence and power in media, government, finance, and academia." End of quote. And so I leave you with this. Without George Soros' money, would the Saul Alinsky Chicago machine still be rolling? Would Acorn and La Raza still be pursuing their nefarious activities? Would our college campuses still be retirement homes for 1960s radicals? Now, in my opinion, I think it's pretty clear. America stands at the brink of an abyss, and that fact is directly attributable to George Soros. George Soros has vigorously, cleverly, and insidiously planned the ruination of America, and his political puppets lead the way. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.